She wasn't hiding in the shadows. She wasn't stalking her victims quietly from a distance. She stood out in the open, right along the highways of Florida, desperate and angry, waiting for strangers to pull over. By the time the full truth emerged, 7 men were dead. The media sensationalized her case. Some people called her a monster, a cold-blooded killer. Others saw her as a tragic victim, a product of a cruel world. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos, a woman whose crimes shocked an entire nation and whose complex psychology continues to divide the world, even today. Between late 1989 and 1990, a string of mysterious deaths began to haunt the highways of Central Florida. Men, mostly middle-aged, started turning up dead. At first, the police didn't connect the dots. They thought maybe it was a series of unrelated robberies gone wrong. Then, they considered it a bizarre coincidence. For a while, they had no leads at all, and the cases grew cold. But as more bodies were discovered, a disturbing and undeniable pattern finally emerged. The victims were all men who had picked up a hitchhiker. And the killer wasn't trying to hide her gender. She wasn't blending into the background. The person responsible was a woman, and she was killing completely on her own. To truly understand the story of Aileen Wuornos, you have to go back to the very beginning, to understand where she came from. Her life started with abandonment. Her father was in prison before she was born, and her mother left her and her brother when they were just toddlers. They were sent to live with their grandparents, but this was far from a safe haven. She was raised in an environment of extreme instability. From a young age, she was exposed to constant neglect, severe abuse, and shocking violence. By her early teenage years, she was already living on the streets, forced to survive on her own. She had no safety net, no one to protect her, and absolutely no one to fall back on. Psychologists who later studied her case described her childhood as one of the most profoundly traumatic backgrounds they had ever documented among serial killers. Aileen didn't grow up with the belief that the world was a safe and caring place. She grew up with the deep-seated conviction that the world was hostile and that she had to fight for every moment of her survival. As an adult, Aileen lived on the absolute margins of society. Her life was a transient one. She hitchhiked from town to town, drifting without a real home or a stable job. She survived however she could, often through sex work and petty crime. Much of her life was spent along the very highways that would later become her hunting grounds. These were places of constant movement, anonymity, and ever-present danger. In this world, she met countless men, many of whom saw her not as a person, but as something disposable, something to be used and then discarded. And over the years, something inside of her began to harden. The constant fear she lived with slowly turned into a simmering anger. That anger grew and festered, eventually turning into a deep-seated hatred. And one day, that hatred finally erupted into unimaginable violence. Aileen Wuornos murdered 7 men. In her confessions and interviews, she consistently claimed it was all in self-defense. She insisted that every single one of the men had either assaulted her or attempted to. Investigators, however, largely disagreed with her version of events. Some of the evidence at the crime scenes pointed towards robbery as a motive. She had taken her victims' cars and personal belongings. But other details suggested something much more personal, something that went beyond simple theft. They pointed towards pure, unadulterated rage. What made her case so deeply unsettling to the public and to law enforcement wasn't just the fact that she was a female serial killer, which was rare enough. It was the raw, explosive emotion behind the killings. Unlike many of the male serial killers that profilers were used to studying, Aileen didn't seem to be driven by a desire for power, control, or sadistic pleasure. She appeared to act out of a volatile mix of fury, paranoia, and a twisted survival instinct, an instinct that had been warped and distorted by years and years of trauma. Her violence wasn't calculated and methodical. It was explosive, reactive, and chaotic. Psychologists and criminal profilers struggled to categorize Aileen Wuornos. She didn't fit neatly into any of their established profiles. She wasn't the cold, detached, and organized predator that many serial killers are. She was intensely emotional, highly reactive, and profoundly unstable. This made her both fascinating and terrifying. One school of thought argued that she was, in essence, a product of her environment, a direct result of a lifetime of horrific abuse. They saw her as a woman who was so broken by her past that her violent actions were an almost inevitable outcome. Others argued that, while her past was tragic, she was still a person with free will who fully understood the nature of her actions and made a conscious choice to commit murder. The real, and perhaps more complicated, truth likely lies somewhere in between. Aileen was a deeply damaged human being, but she was also a responsible adult who made choices that had deadly consequences. It's this duality, this combination of victim and perpetrator, that has made her case so unforgettable and so endlessly debated. In early 1991, Aileen Wuornos was finally arrested. The break in the case came after she was involved in a car accident while driving one of her victims' cars. Once in custody, she confessed to the murders. Her interrogations and later interviews were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. At times, she would express what appeared to be genuine remorse, crying for her victims and their families. At other times, she would fly into a rage, lashing out at the world, the justice system, and everyone she felt had wronged her. Watching these interviews was painful. This wasn't someone enjoying their moment in the spotlight or reveling in notoriety. This was the raw, unfiltered image of a human being completely unraveling before the world's eyes. Aileen Wuornos was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to death. During her time on death row, her mental state continued to deteriorate. She became increasingly unstable, paranoid, and erratic. In a shocking turn, she began to actively fight against her own legal team. She fired her attorneys, refused to file any more appeals, and rejected any help that was offered to her. In the end, she demanded that her execution be carried out as quickly as possible. In October of 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final words were a strange, rambling statement that reflected her deep anger, her profound confusion, and ultimately, her resignation to her fate. A life that had been defined by so much suffering from its earliest moments ended in complete isolation. The story of Aileen Wuornos forces us all to confront some very uncomfortable questions. Where does personal responsibility end, and the impact of trauma begin? Can someone be both a predator and a victim at the same time? Was she born a monster, or was she created by a society that failed to protect her at every turn? There are no easy answers to these questions, and perhaps that's why her story continues to haunt us. But one thing is absolutely certain: her life and her crimes are a chilling reminder that violence doesn't always come from cold calculation and meticulous planning. Sometimes, it comes from a lifetime of being broken. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the human condition.